Economics cannot be free from value judgment, especially political value judgments. There are at least 5 reasons why this is the case. Well, the first reason is that economics is in large part about government economic policy. It may be positive about it, it may be negative about it. There's even within neoclassical economics, there's the market failure approach, which says real-world markets often fail to produce the result expected in economic theory of perfect competition because of monopolies, because of externalities, because of public goods, and there are good reasons to intervene for the government to bring individual cost-benefit structure in line with social cost-benefit structure. Within the neoclassical school, there's also the government failure approach, corruption, inefficiency, bureaucracy. So, you may be positive or negative about the government intervention, but the point is that a lot of economics is actually about government policy. Even the idea of laissez-faire, that is a policy. Doing nothing doesn't actually mean literally not doing anything. It supports a particular type of government policy. The analysis of government policy within the neoclassical economics has developed much further. Because in the beginning, they said we are renaming the subject to get rid of the politics. But then, barely one generation after, along came Arthur Pigou, then professor at University of Cambridge, with this idea of externality, and from there developed a whole range of analysis called the market failure approach. No, frankly, if you apply this approach to its logical limit, there'll be very few areas where you cannot have government intervention, because markets fail all the time. And then, despite this pretension that we are getting out of politics, the subject actually has developed far more tools to analyze the policies and politics. Politics can influence the way economic research is done. So, for example, in the old days, under socialism, the government basically banned research on bourgeois neoclassical economics, unless it is done to criticize it. But it's not just the socialists. Many right-wing dictatorships used to ban the study of Marxist economics. I grew up under military dictatorship in South Korea in the 1970s and 80s, and it was illegal to be in possession of books by, for example, Karl Marx. You could go to prison for that. It could be a bit more subtle than that. In the 1950s and 60s, under so-called McCarthyism in the United States, you had systematic persecution of Marxist economists in universities. Secondly, economically powerful people can and have influenced economic research through funding. There are many pro-free market think tanks like Institute of Economic Affairs in this country, or the Heritage Foundation and Cato Institute in America, that have been funded by the rich people to generate research that justify free market approach. Even when there's no direct pressure on the economics profession to study particular types of economics, what is the main topic of research is very heavily influenced by the politics of the day. So right after the Second World War, full employment was on the top of research agenda for most economists, because that's when the society was reformed after the Great Depression and the Second World War, and the working class power rose with increasing unionization, coming to power of social democratic parties in many countries. So full employment, which was the concern for the workers, was at the top of research agenda. Since the 1980s, with the rise of so-called neoliberalism,
a double act that, for better or worse, changed the world.
Realignment of politics in many countries, full employment has basically more or less disappeared from the research agenda of economics. inequality, which was supposed to be a non-issue until, say, 2005, 6, 7, is suddenly coming back as a popular item in research agenda for economists, because now there's a growing concern that the gap between the super rich and the rest is widening, and this increasing gap is even negatively influencing things like democracy and civic rights and so on. So, there's now much greater concern about inequality. So we've already seen 3 ways in which politics can influence economics, but there's also causality in the other direction. Because economic theory actually affects the way the government, not just the economy, is organized. So in the socialist countries in the past, you had this Marxist theory that says the best way to organize the economy is to plan it centrally. Now, in order to do that, you basically have to create a huge government apparatus. You cannot just have one kind of central planning bureau issuing projections and estimates. No. You need Ministry of Textile, Ministry of Light Consumer Goods, you need the Ministry of Coal. In the capitalist countries in the last few decades, especially in the US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, influenced by the government failure approach, many countries have reorganized their government. Because the government failure approach recommends that you should shrink the size of the state to the minimum, but also introduce a lot of market principles. So these countries have privatized their state-owned enterprises. The UK used to have one of the biggest state-owned enterprise sector in the world. Not anymore. A lot of government activities have been outsourced. So in this country, you have a lot of the apparently public agencies which basically provide public services by contracting these out to private providers. These are not government services in the traditional sense anymore. You can see how powerful the influence of economic theories can be on the organization of the government as well as the economy. The third reason why economics is intertwined with politics is that all economic theories contain political value judgments. Many of the differences between different economic schools are due to their different views on economic things, like how technologies evolve, how market competition works. They all have different theories, but there are many differences that fundamentally come from differences in political value judgments. Now, sometimes these political differences are embodied in what look like a technical difference. The best example is the Pareto criterion, that is a central principle within neoclassical economics. Now, what is a Pareto criterion? Pareto criterion says that you cannot call a social change an improvement if it makes even a single person worse off. Now, in the beginning, when the neoclassical economics emerged out of classical economics in the late 19th century, neoclassical economics also subscribed to this idea of utilitarianism. You have heard of this, Jeremy Bentham, the greatest happiness of the greatest majority. In the early 20th century, Vilfredo Pareto, this half Italian, half French economist who taught in Switzerland, some of his followers came up and said, no, actually that is not acceptable. If you run the society in that kind of way, it means that you can demand sacrifice by a minority for the greater good. Let me give you a more intuitive explanation with what I call the one-finger story. Tomorrow morning, someone knocks at my door. Oh, Dr. Chang, we found this marvelous technology that will solve the climate change problem overnight. And I say, oh, great, what is it? Well, never mind the details, but we came to you to ask for help. Well, I'm only an economist. I don't know anything about science. No, you can help. What is it? Oh, this machine has already been built. It's all primed up, ready to go, but we need one little input, which we want you to have the honor of providing. So I say, what is it? Well, we need one live human finger to start this machine. Yeah, well, even before they finish the sentence, I run into my kitchen, cut my little finger off, and give it to them. Well, what is one finger compared to the whole world? But what if it's one arm? Of course I'll do it. What if it's my life? Maybe. What if it's a life of my family? What if it's a life of 50 million South Koreans? Or 70 million North and South Koreans? This is a problem with this utilitarian thinking. Because, you can always say, well, you can make a little concession. And then where do you stop? Where do you draw the line? Before you know it, you are in the same bed with Stalin and Hitler. The greater good. So Pareto was making a very powerful ethical point. You just cannot sacrifice individuals for the greater good. What it is saying is also that you cannot touch the status quo. You might have a very unequal country, and someone might propose, if we raise taxes for the rich by this much and redistribute it to the poorest people, we can reduce poverty by this much, we can reduce inequality by this much. But if the people who are going to be taxed say no, you cannot do it if you believed in Pareto principle. So one person can veto the whole thing. Now, I'm not saying that there's an easy answer to this. In between absolute defense of the status quo and this the tyranny of the majority. But what I can with certainty tell you is that Pareto criterion is a very political position. In this context, my favorite quote comes from this Brazilian bishop called Dom Helder Camara, who was one of the leaders of the so-called liberation theology, which was this radical Catholic theology that was popular in Latin America in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. I mean, some of the more extreme members actually advocated even armed struggle. And he once famously said, when I give food to poor people, they call me a saint. When I ask why they have not enough to eat, they call me a communist. No, I think as a trained social scientist, we should all become a bit of a communist. No, you should always question the underlying social order that is creating these problems. The limitations of Pareto criterion is that it doesn't ask that question. It accepts the existing distribution of income and power, and then say, well, what if we do this? Is anyone going to get hurt? So when you have things like that sitting in the very middle of neoclassical economic theory, how can you say that it is an apolitical, scientific understanding of the world? Power is something that is very understudied in economics. Even political scientists whose central interest is power don't seem to be able to agree on a single definition. Within the dominant economic approach, that is the neoclassical school, there's only one kind of power, which is called market power. This is when someone has a monopoly, or a few firms have oligopoly, or someone has monopsony, which is the dominant position as a buyer. So there is that power, market power, within neoclassical economics, but other than that, power is not there. But even when there is no market power, there are at least 3 other forms of power that matter in our understanding of the economy. Well, many neoclassical economists see the competitive market as a place devoid of power relationships, because market exchanges are voluntary. So under feudalism in Europe, the lord of the manor would demand that their serfs work, say, 3 out of 5 days in their field, rather than the SERP's own fields. Under the central planning system, the Central Planning Authority would decide that, well, next year we are going to produce only black shoes, no pattern shoes. So they have to buy them. But within free market, there is no such authority. So people make these voluntary exchanges, and the thinking is, well, if it is not to their benefit, no one will go into these contracts. So, for example, if there's a poor person in India, say, signing up to work in this factory that involves toxic chemicals, which he knows is likely to make him sick in the next few years, and probably going to kill him in the next 10, 15 years. If he signs up to this job, knowing this, neoclassical economists say, no problem. Yeah, the guy has made a calculation. But this interpretation ignores the fact that people with little independent means of income and wealth voluntarily do unpleasant things, dangerous things, things that are even sure to kill them in due course because they have no alternative. Karl Marx made a sort of career out of emphasizing this point, but even Adam Smith, in his book, The Wealth of Nations, there's this passage where he explicitly says that, well, basically workers have to accept whatever wages that are offered to them by the capitalists because they are not going to last even a week without working. In contrast, most capitalists can live very happily without employing any worker for a couple of years because they have money. Of course, they want to make more money, so that's why they are running factories where if the worst comes to worst, okay, forget about that employing people. At least in the rich capitalist countries, this imbalance compared to the days of Adam Smith or Karl Marx has shrunk quite a lot because the workers have the welfare state. They have trade unions that provide some, say, means of subsistence if they go on a strike and so on. But the imbalance is still there. And it might be actually increasing because of the increasing income inequality, the shrinkage in the welfare state in many, although not all, advanced capitalist economies, the weakening of trade unions, and the rise of the so-called gig economy in which workers are bogusly classified as independent suppliers and deprived of the workers' rights that are constituted in the laws. The second type of power is what I call the power to dictate things within organizations. What do I mean by that? Herbert Simon, the father of the behavioralist school, whom in one of my earlier books I called the last Renaissance man because he was originally trained as a political scientist, but then became one of the founding fathers of artificial intelligence and also studied psychology, management, and economics. In that article, he observed that, well, if you invited a Martian or some alien being to come and watch the Earth economy, how would it describe the Earth economy? Would they call it the market economy? Never. Because in his reckoning, something like 80% of economic decisions are made within organizations, like companies, governments, cooperatives. He was pointing to our neglect of this vast area of the economy, which does not work according to market principle. So within these organizations, basically there's a hierarchical power-based relationship. If you are a guy lower down the hierarchical chain, basically you will do what your superior tells you. There's no bargaining. given that this the kind of relationship covers basically 80% of the economy, or at least a vast majority, not understanding this power relationship means that we are understanding only a smaller part of the economy. The third, the power to make people think what you want them to think. At the deepest level, this is the most important power. If you can do that, you don't need police, you don't need army, you don't need prison. People will do what you want. The most obvious example is advertising. Advertising provides you with certain information and influences your choice given your preferences, but it often goes deeper. It actually changes your preferences. This is why the advertisers love to use celebrities and sports stars, because somehow people then get to associate this product with a high life, high achievement. People with money have and still do influence other people so that they acquire worldviews that are fundamentally against their own interests, but are good for defending the status quo. Karl Marx used to call this false consciousness. So given your objective interest as the struggling blue-collar worker in Midwest in the United States, why would you vote for someone like Donald Trump? So people said that these people have false consciousness. It's the false idea. Well, these days we call this the matrix. And there are numerous examples of false consciousness in history. So many slaves in the US, in Brazil, in the old days, they help their masters to oppress other slaves because they believed that this was the right social order. And how dare this young guy that tried to break out of this order ordained by God. The scenes we have seen after the introduction of the so-called Obamacare, the healthcare reform that Barack Obama was trying to introduce into the United States, these old people saying, keep government out of my Medicare. Hello, Medicare is a government program. But these people have been so brainwashed by the American health insurance industry that government healthcare programs never work. They couldn't imagine that this nice little program that is helping them in his old age to cope with disease and other problems called Medicare is a government program. So understanding this the issue of false consciousness or the matrix is crucial in understanding economics. Most economists believe that politics is an irrational force that interferes with the rational workings of the market. We've seen this in this country in the run-up to the so-called Brexit referendum. Economists were coming out in great forces, arguing that this is going to destroy the economy. I mean, I'm not disputing whether they were right or wrong, and then when the people didn't vote the way they thought that they should, they started complaining, this is why democracy is bad for economic management. People don't understand these things. When people say things like this, the politics is an irrational force impinging on the rationality of the market and so on, what they are implicitly assuming is that there's a clearly scientifically definable boundary of the market into which political forces should not be allowed. So a lot of countries have done things to make that possible in the last few decades. A lot of countries have given political independence to the central bank. Because the argument was, if you let politicians dictate how monetary policy can be run, this irrational political considerations will come into the management of monetary policy. The problem with this argument is that actually there's no such objective boundary around the market that you can draw. My view is that the freedom of the market is in the eyes of the beholder. There's no scientific way to say up to this should be left to the logic of the market, and beyond that, you can have government intervention. Let me give you an example. Child labor. In 1819, a bunch of reformist MPs in the British Parliament tabled this motion that was supposed to introduce this law to regulate child labor. And by today's standard, this was a joke. First of all, it was supposed to apply only to cotton textile. There were millions of children working in coal mines and working as chimney sweep and other types of factories, but it was supposed to be only for the cotton factory because this was considered particularly dangerous for children. At the time, the technology of producing cotton textile produced a lot of dust. And this dust would settle in the workers' lungs and cause disease. And a lot of children died in the cotton textile factories. So they said, okay, this is the worst case, so we are going to regulate that. And then they said, of course, we cannot ban all child labor, so we are going to regulate it. So they said very young children shouldn't work under the age of 9. Between 9 and 16, they could work, but only reduced hours. How many? 12. This is time when adult workers were working 15, 16 hours a day, so 12 hours was considered light. But even then, a lot of people are up in arms. Parliamentarians, economists, factory owners. And the strongest argument was this regulation fundamentally goes against the foundation of the free market economy, namely the freedom of contract. These children want to work. Actually, they need to work. These people want to employ them. What is your problem? Well, fast forward 2 centuries. Today, no politician, no economist, at least in the rich countries, say we need to bring back child labor in order to truly make our labor market free. In many developing countries, where unfortunately there is still widespread child labor, in many developing countries, 40 to 50% of population is children, because they had recently very fast population growth. It's the biggest possible regulation that you can think of. You are basically potentially pushing half the labor force out of the labor market. No one sees it that way these days because we have accepted this different value. So that's why I said that, like beauty, freedom of the market is in the eyes of the beholder. And one person could say, wow, that's a free market. Another might say, well, what are you talking about? This is the most highly regulated market I've ever seen. George W. Bush, in his typical idiot savant way, put this point across beautifully when he was announcing the $700 billion bailout package for American banks following the 2008 financial crisis. He argued that what he was doing was the continuation of the American system of free enterprise, which rests on the conviction that the federal government should intervene only when necessary. But who decides when it is necessary? What economic theory do you use? So in this vein, I would argue that defining the free market is at the deepest level a pointless exercise because there's no such thing as a free market. All markets are constrained by institutions that determine who can participate, what can be exchanged, what are the rights and obligations of people who are involved in the process, how to run the exchange process, and so on. And all of these have underlying political and even ethical assumptions. Now, if you ask free market economists, do you really think there are, in reality, these textbook-style free markets in existence? They'll probably say, well, I mean, that's an ideal, but there's one market that comes pretty close to it, which is the stock market. Instantaneous price adjustment, very rapid spread of information. But does this mean that I can turn up at the doorstep of London Stock Exchange tomorrow morning with a bag full of the shares of my company and sell them? No. Why? Because I have to get listed. Okay, having been told that I have to list my company, I come back home and I call the London Stock Exchange and ask someone to list my company. Can I do it? No. Because you need the vetting process. Depending on the country, depending on the exchange, you might have to produce huge amount of documentation, at least about the last 3 to 5 years of your activities, and they'll check whether you are worthy of listing. Okay, so I go through this process, and then does it mean that I can then go to London Stock Exchange and sell my shares? No, because you have to be a licensed broker and trader to do that. I cannot sell those shares myself. Right after the eruption of the 2008 financial crisis, many countries shut down their stock market. It's known as holidays. Basically, to calm the nerves, they shut down these markets. So even in the stock market, there are so many regulations telling you what you can do, what you cannot do, who can do it, who cannot do it. And when it comes to other markets, there are even more restrictions because this is one of the freest markets. So in many countries, you are not allowed to trade in addictive drugs or human organs or human beings. Yeah, but when you think about it, why not? I'm told that in Iran that you can sell your kidney legally. Until the 1960s and 70s, in most countries, you could patent a drug invented by someone else as far as you make it through a different process. So traditionally in chemical and pharmaceutical industries, there were these two notions of patents. One is product patent, so invention of a chemical substance that can act on certain diseases, and the process patent, having identified the chemical, how you make it. And most countries actually gave only process patent because the reasoning was that, well, we cannot give you product patent because this chemical has always existed in nature, which is why countries like India, Brazil, and Thailand could produce these copy drugs with impunity because as far as you make it through a different chemical process, you could do it. How you deal with fraud, how you deal with bankruptcy, if some company that has been supplying you goes bankrupt, how do you get compensation? There's a huge range of issues that need legal regulation. And all of these regulations are based on some notions of justice, some notions of what is someone's right and someone's obligation. And basically, the conclusion is that we think a market is free only because we so totally accept the underlying political and even ethical assumptions that create this body of regulations that define that market, that we stop seeing them. There are these people, some libertarian economists, who make a case for slavery. We all own ourselves. And if it's a voluntary agreement that you sell yourself as a slave to someone, that's okay. Yeah, I mean, is there any economic reason why that shouldn't be the case? Well, of course, most people find this idea absurd because they implicitly understand that people will give up their freedom and sell themselves as a slave only when they have no other alternative. So basically what I'm trying to say is that market itself is a political construct. It is based on a host of regulations that embody political and sometimes even ethical values. And for that reason, it is an illusion to think that economics can be politics-free. Because the ultimate economic category for people who believe that, i.e. the market, is actually politically constructed. Economics is a wonderful subject, pretending that it's a science of everything, that you can explain everything from income inequality to climate change to Japanese sumo wrestlers and Chicago drug dealers. That's when you have a problem.